They called her reckless. They called her a child who didn't know the first thing about dirt. They said she was throwing away 3 generations of sweat and prayer and sunburned mornings. But on the afternoon of the 14th of October, when the county weighbridge scales stopped climbing and the final number settled on a figure no one in the state had ever seen before, the same people who had laughed at her stood in a silence so thick you could have cut it with a harvest blade. That number didn't just break the county record. It didn't just break the state record. It made agricultural history. And it all started because a 17-year-old girl refused to let her father poison a piece of land that was begging for mercy. Clara Whitmore had grown up in the shadow of wheat. Her family had farmed the same rolling acres outside of Millbrook, Kansas, since her great-grandfather staked his claim with blistered hands and a stubbornness that ran deeper than the bedrock itself. The Whitmore farm had seen good years and bad years, dust storms and bumper crops, but by the spring of Clara's 17th year, the land was suffering in a way no one could quite name. The wheat came up thin and pale, like an old man's hair. The soil, once dark and rich as chocolate cake, had turned a tired, ashy gray that crumbled between your fingers like stale flour. Her father, Henry Whitmore, walked the fields with his shoulders hunched so low he seemed to be searching for something he'd lost in the dirt. Something the chemicals and the certified seed and the bank loans couldn't seem to replace. The bank had sent their second notice in March. The co-op had cut their advance in half, citing poor performance history. And the neighbors, good Christian folk who had shared combines and casseroles and funeral pies for 40 years, had started looking at the Whitmore place with a particular kind of pity that stings far worse than mockery. Everyone knew the Whitmores were one bad season away from losing everything. Everyone knew that Henry's wife, Clara's mother, had passed 2 winters ago after a quiet battle with cancer, taking with her the gentle strength that had always held the farm together like mortar between stones. And everyone knew that Henry Whitmore's only child was a girl who spent more time reading old books in the attic than learning how to calibrate a combine or read a futures chart. They didn't know the half of it. Clara had always been different. While other farm kids were learning to mend barbed wire and judge the weather by the ache in their knees, Clara was poring over her grandmother's journals in the dusty corners of the attic. Her grandmother, Evelyn Whitmore, had been something of a legend in her own right. A woman who had kept the farm alive during the Dust Bowl when the men had given up and walked away, who had planted by the phases of the moon and sworn by remedies that the university extension agents dismissed as old wives' tales. Evelyn had died before Clara was born, but she had left behind a cedar trunk packed with leather notebooks, hand-labeled seed packets, and handwritten observations that smelled of dried lavender and thyme. It was in that trunk, on a rainy Tuesday in late April, that Clara found the envelope. It was tucked inside a journal from 1952, the year of the terrible drought that had driven half the county off their land. The envelope was yellowed and brittle, held together with a faded blue ribbon that disintegrated at her touch. Inside were seeds, small, dark, and oddly shaped, nothing like the uniform, polished wheat kernels her father bought from the co-op every fall. They looked wild, ancient. A note in Evelyn's sharp, slanting hand read simply, "For when the land forgets how to breathe, plant between the rows. Trust the weeds. Do not let them spray. E." Clara held those seeds in her palm and felt something she couldn't explain, a warmth, a certainty. The same feeling she had experienced as a small child when her mother would tuck her into bed during a thunderstorm and whisper that the land always provides for those who listen to its heartbeat instead of just counting its output. That night, she made a decision that would either save her family or destroy them. The North 40 was the worst field, 40 acres of pale, stunted wheat that looked more like straw than a crop. Henry had already written it off in his mind, though he had never said so out loud. Clara waited until her father was snoring in his recliner. Worn out from another day of fighting a losing battle against a soil that seemed to have given up. She filled her coat pockets with Evelyn's mysterious seeds, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped out into the April night. The air smelled of rain and turned earth and possibility. Clara walked the furrows with the confidence of someone who had studied this land in ways her father never had. Not as a machine to be optimized, but as a living body to be healed. She wasn't just planting seeds. She was planting hope in measured, desperate handfuls. She scattered Evelyn's seeds between the rows of failing wheat, pressing them into the soil with her bare hands, whispering prayers she wasn't sure she believed, row after row, acre after acre, until her pockets were empty and her knees were mud-caked, and her heart was hammering with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She didn't know for certain what would grow. She only knew that her grandmother had trusted these seeds when the land was dying, and that trust had to mean something in a world that had forgotten how to trust anything but chemicals and quarterly reports. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The wheat continued its sad, pale growth. Henry sprayed the south fields with herbicide and fertilizer, following the co-op schedule with the devotion of a man clinging to a religion he feared was false. Then, on a morning in mid-May, Clara walked the North 40 and saw it. Tiny green shoots pushing through the soil between the wheat rows. They didn't look like wheat. They looked like weeds. Broadleaves, hairy stems, a wild, unruly vigor that seemed almost aggressive compared to the sickly wheat struggling beside them. Clara's heart sank. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe they were just common pigweed, the enemy her father had spent 30 years eradicating. But she remembered her grandmother's words, "Trust the weeds," and she decided to wait. She decided to believe. It was her father who discovered them first. Henry Whitmore had driven his battered pickup to the North 40 to check on a broken irrigation line. He stood at the edge of the field, his coffee growing cold in his hand, staring at the strips of broad-leaved plants, weaving between his wheat rows like unwelcome guests at a funeral. His face went from confusion to disbelief to a rage so pure and hot it made Clara's blood run cold when she saw it from the barn window. "What in God's name?" he whispered. Then louder, his voice carrying across the empty acres. "Clara!" She came running from the barn, wiping motor oil from her hands, her heart already sinking through her boots. She knew before she reached him. She could see it in the way he stood, a man betrayed by his own blood, in the one place he thought he was still in control. "Did you do this?" His voice was barely controlled, a tremor running through it like a fault line. "Did you plant weeds in my wheat field?" "They're not weeds, Daddy," Clara said, her voice small but steady, her chin lifted despite the fear clawing at her throat. They're pigweed. They're cocklebur. They're every damn thing I've spent 30 years fighting." Henry's face had gone crimson, the color of sunset and warning. He gestured wildly at the field, his calloused hands shaking. "Do you know what this looks like? Do you have any idea what the co-op will say? What the neighbors will say? My own daughter has turned my field into a jungle." "They're cover crops," Clara said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to run. Grandma Evelyn used them. In her journals, she wrote about how they saved the farm during the drought of '52. She called them nurse plants. They fix nitrogen, they hold moisture, "Your grandmother is dead," Henry roared, and the words hit Clara like a physical blow, stealing her breath. "She's been dead for 30 years and the world has moved on. We don't plant by moonlight and folk tales anymore, Clara. We use science. We use herbicide. We use the methods that built this farm and fed this family. And those methods are failing." Clara shouted back, surprising them both with the force of her voice. Tears burned her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She gestured at the dying fields around them. "Look at it, Daddy. Look at the wheat. It's dying. The soil is dead. And you're so busy being angry that you can't see the field is begging for something different, something older, something true." Henry stared at her as if she were a stranger who had wandered onto his land speaking a language he didn't recognize. Then, he turned and walked back to his truck without another word. He didn't speak to her for 2 days. He didn't look at her. He moved through the house like a ghost, and Clara lay awake at night wondering if she had destroyed the only family she had left. But the neighbors spoke enough for both of them. Word travels fast in farm country, and by the end of the week, everyone within 20 miles knew that Henry Whitmore's daughter had gone and planted weeds in his wheat field. The coffee shop at the grain elevator buzzed with it like a hive of angry bees. At the feed store, old men shook their heads and muttered about the younger generation and what happens when you let a girl run wild after her mama dies. Even the preacher at the First Methodist Church found a way to work it into his Sunday sermon about the foolishness of youth and the importance of honoring your father's wisdom. Everyone laughed when they heard, said Dale Kowalski, who farmed the section to the east and had never missed a chance to remind Henry that his own son was already managing 300 acres at 22 and had just bought a new John Deere outright. They called her crazy, a 17-year-old girl playing scientist in her daddy's dirt. Some folks said Henry ought to have her tested. Others said it was what happens when you let grief make you soft. I heard one man say he wouldn't be surprised if the bank foreclosed by Christmas. The county extension agent, a man named Bruce Harlow, with a clipboard, a polyester tie, and a permanent expression of disapproval, drove out to the Whitmore place on a Tuesday morning. He walked the North 40 with his lips pursed so tight they turned white, making notes in a leather binder with the efficiency of a man conducting an autopsy. When he finished, he found Henry on the porch and delivered his verdict with the cold precision of someone who had never once lain awake at 3 in the morning worrying about a mortgage payment or a daughter's college fund. "Henry, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. That field is compromised. Those broadleaf plants are competing for nitrogen, for water, for sunlight. Your wheat is already stressed from the poor spring. If you don't spray immediately, and I mean a full burn down with something strong, you're looking at a total loss on 40 acres. Possibly more if the seeds drift, or if the root systems have already established below the wheat zone." Henry listened, with his jaw clenched, his hands white-knuckled on the porch railing, staring out at the field that had betrayed him. What if we cultivated between the rows, tried to manage it, worked around it? Harlow laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the sound of authority mocking uncertainty. "Manage weeds, Henry? You're a good farmer. One of the best in this county. You know better than that. Weeds don't get managed, they get eliminated. Your daughter has cost you this season. The question is whether you're going to let her cost you the farm." That night, Henry sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. The bank notices spread before him like a losing hand of cards. Clara watched him from the doorway, her heart breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. She wanted to go to him to explain, to show him the journal entries where Evelyn had described harvests so bountiful the wagons couldn't hold them all, where she had written about soil so alive it smelled sweet as bread dough. But she could see the defeat in her father's posture, the way his broad farmer's shoulders had narrowed under the weight of shame and fear and the crushing loneliness of a man who didn't know how to ask for help. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "please, just give it until July. If the wheat doesn't improve, If the weeds take over, I'll pull every plant by hand. I'll work day and night. I swear on Mama's memory." Henry looked up at her, and in his eyes Clara saw something that terrified her more than any bank notice or neighbor's gossip. She saw doubt, not in her, in himself, in the farm, in the future he had always assumed would be there, steady as sunrise. "1 month," he said, his voice rough as gravel and just as final. "And then we burn it down, Clara. All of it, every last weed. Do you understand me?" June came hot and dry, riding on a wind that felt like it had been baked in an oven, the kind of weather that turns topsoil to powder and makes farmers check the sky every 17 minutes like clockwork, praying for clouds that never come. The conventional wheat fields in the county began to show stress, lighter heads, thinner stalks, the pale green of plants begging for moisture that wasn't there. Farmers started talking about crop insurance and whether the adjusters would be generous this year. But in the North 40, something strange was happening. The weeds Clara had planted were thriving with a vigor that seemed almost defiant. They grew knee-high, then waist-high, their broad leaves creating a living mulch that shaded the soil and held moisture like a sponge beneath a sink. Beneath their canopy, the wheat stalks, which should have been choked out by competition according to every textbook Bruce Harlow had ever read, were standing taller. Their heads were fuller, their color was a deep, vigorous green that made the neighboring fields look sick and anemic by comparison. Clara noticed it first, of course. She had been walking the rows every morning before dawn, notebook in hand, recording heights and colors, and the number of tillers per plant with the dedication of a scientist and the faith of a pilgrim. But she wasn't the only one who saw it. Old Jed Carter, who had farmed the south section for 50 years and had mocked Henry Whitmore at the co-op just weeks before, found himself driving past the North 40 on his way to town. He slowed his truck, squinted through the fence line, and felt a strange tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his blood pressure medication. The Whitmore wheat looked wrong. Wrong in a way that made his own fields look anemic and tired. Wrong in a way that made him remember his own grandfather talking about farming before the chemicals, before the endless spray schedules and genetically modified seeds, when the land knew how to heal itself if you just got out of its way and let the old wisdom work. He didn't stop that day. He didn't say anything to anyone, but he slowed down again the next day and the day after that, and he started to notice things he hadn't seen in decades. Butterflies drifting above the fence line, bees thick as fog in the morning air, birds diving into the field to feed on insects that had returned from wherever they had gone. By mid-June, the difference was undeniable. The North 40 wheat stood thick and heavy-headed, the stalks so sturdy they barely swayed in the wind, and the weeds, which Clara had finally identified from her grandmother's journals as a rare heirloom variety of crimson clover, mixed with something Evelyn had called nurse grass and deep-rooted chicory, had begun to flower. Purple and white blossoms bobbed between the golden-green wheat, and the air above the field hummed with bees and butterflies and beneficial insects that hadn't been seen in those parts in generations. The county agent came back. This time, Bruce Harlow didn't laugh. He walked the field in silence, his clipboard forgotten in the truck, his tie loosened in the June heat. He knelt in the dirt and ran his fingers through the soil beneath the clover canopy, and his eyes widened despite his professional composure. It was dark, crumbly, alive with earthworms that squirmed away from the light. The nitrogen levels, he would later tell his colleagues in a voice that still held a note of disbelief, were off the charts. The soil temperature was 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding fields, and the wheat was registering protein levels that hadn't been seen in Kansas since before the war. since before the Green Revolution convinced everyone that nature needed to be beaten into submission. This isn't possible, Harlow muttered to himself. But the evidence was growing all around him, tall and defiant and utterly alive, waving in the breeze like a flag of rebellion. Clara stood at the edge of the field, her arms crossed, her chin lifted, her boots dusty. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. The field said it for her, in a language older than mockery and more powerful than doubt, a language of roots and rainfall and the stubborn will to live. But the real test was still to come. July arrived with a vengeance that made the June heat seem like a pleasant memory. A heat dome settled over the Midwest, pushing temperatures into triple digits for 11 straight days. The county declared a drought emergency. Cornfields withered to brown skeletons. Soybeans crisped and died. Farmers watched their irrigation bills climb into the stratosphere while their crops died anyway, victims of a sky that refused to open. Henry Whitmore walked his south fields, his conventional fields, his pride, with a sick feeling in his gut that no amount of antacid could fix. The wheat there, planted with certified seed and sprayed with the best herbicides money could buy and fertilized according to the co-op schedule, was hanging on, but barely. The heads were small, the kernels shriveled like raisins. He knew, with the fatalism of a man who has seen too many droughts steal too many dreams, that the yield would be disastrous. Maybe 20 bushels an acre if he was lucky, maybe less. But when he drove to the North 40, expecting to see the same devastation, the same brown death that had claimed his neighbor's crops, he stopped his truck in the middle of the gravel road and simply stared, his mouth open, his hands frozen on the steering wheel. The clover had gone dormant in the heat, its deep roots pulling moisture from layers of soil the wheat couldn't reach, from places the irrigation never touched. As the clover rested, it released stored nitrogen into the root zone, feeding the wheat precisely when it needed it most. The broad leaves had created a microclimate, cooler, more humid, protected from the desiccating wind that was killing everything else. And the wheat, God help him, the wheat was still green, still growing, still filling out heads that were fat and heavy and impossibly full, bending the stalks under their weight. Henry got out of his truck on legs that didn't feel like his own. He walked into the field, the clover blossoms brushing his knees, and he reached out to touch a wheat head that was warm from the sun but vital, alive, thrumming with an energy that made his eyes burn and his throat close up. He stood there for a long time, a big man in a dying county, surrounded by a miracle he didn't understand and hadn't earned. And when he finally turned around, Clara was standing at the edge of the field, watching him with her mother's eyes, patient, loving, unafraid. "Daddy," she said, and her voice was steady as the land itself. "It's going to be okay." Henry Whitmore, who hadn't cried since his wife's funeral, who hadn't let himself feel anything for 2 years except anger and fear, felt something hot slide down his cheek. He didn't brush it away. He didn't try to hide it. He just nodded, once, and held out his hand to his daughter. And when she took it, he pulled her close and held her like he hadn't held her since she was small enough to carry on his shoulders. The harvest was scheduled for the second week of October. By then, the story of the Whitmore field had spread far beyond Millbrook, carried on the wind and the telephone lines and the wonder of farmers who had heard impossible rumors. Agricultural professors from the state university had come to take soil samples, their eyes wide behind their glasses. A reporter from the Kansas City Star had written a front-page article with the headline, "The Weed Girl of Millbrook," that made Clara wince with embarrassment. And every farmer in 3 counties planned to be at the Whitmore place when the combines rolled, because no one could believe the rumors they'd heard, and everyone needed to see the proof with their own eyes. needed to know if the old ways still had power in a world that had forgotten them. The morning of the 14th of October dawned crisp and golden, the kind of autumn day that makes the Midwest look like a painting by an artist who loved the earth. Henry had hired a custom cutter with a brand new combine that had a digital yield monitor, the kind of technology that measures bushels per acre in real time, beeping out numbers that make or break a season, that determine whether a family keeps their land or loses it to the bank. The crowd gathered at the edge of the North 40 was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. Dale Kowalski was there, standing with his son, his new John Deere parked conspicuously nearby. Bruce Harlow stood with his clipboard, though he hadn't written anything in an hour. Old Jed Carter had brought his grandson, a boy of 12 who wanted to be a farmer when the world seemed determined to make farming impossible. The banker came, looking nervous in his suit. The preacher came, holding his hat in his hands. Even Mrs. Patterson from the library showed up with a camera and a box of tissues because she had read Clara's grandmother's journals in the local history section, and she understood, perhaps better than anyone, that history was being made on this dirt, that the past and future were meeting in a field of wheat and clover. Clara stood beside her father, wearing her mother's old barn coat and a pair of boots that had seen 3 seasons of hard work and were ready for more. She was 17 years old, and for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. The field behind her rippled in the breeze, a sea of gold so deep and rich it seemed to glow from within, as if the sun had decided to store its light in the stalks just for this moment. Henry started the combine himself. He wanted to be the one. He needed to feel the moment when the machine bit into the first row and the truth became undeniable, when numbers replaced rumors and faith became fact. The combine roared to life, a monster of green steel and spinning blades and modern engineering. It rolled into the field and the wheat disappeared into its maw in a river of gold that seemed endless. The digital monitor flickered. The first numbers appeared, glowing green against the black screen. Dale Kowalski, standing closest to the cab, squinted at the screen. Then he took off his hat and held it to his chest, and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. His son leaned in, looked at the numbers, and his face went pale beneath his summer tan. The numbers climbed, and climbed, and climbed. The county average for wheat that year, thanks to the drought that had ravaged the Midwest, was running about 32 bushels per acre. A good year might see 50. An exceptional year, with perfect rain and no pests, and a farmer who slept with one eye on the sky, might touch 60. The Whitmore North 40 was registering 97 bushels per acre, then 98. Then, as the combine moved deeper into the field where the clover had been thickest and the soil had come alive, the monitor flashed a number that made Bruce Harlow's clipboard fall from his numb fingers and land in the dust. 104 bushels per acre. The crowd went silent. Not the silence of disappointment or boredom, the silence of witness. The kind of silence that falls in churches when the organ stops, in courtrooms when the verdict is read, in the moment before a storm breaks and the air itself holds its breath. Every eye was on that combine, on those impossible numbers, on the girl standing in her mother's coat with tears streaming down her face and a smile so bright it hurt to look at, a smile that said everything words couldn't carry. Henry killed the engine. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind in the remaining wheat and the distant caw of a crow and the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. He climbed down from the cab. His legs were shaking so badly he wasn't sure they would hold him. He walked to Clara, and in front of God and the banker and every neighbor who had ever doubted her, every voice that had called her crazy, every eye that had looked at the Whitmore place with pity, he pulled his daughter into his arms and held her. like he hadn't held her since she was small enough to carry, since before the cancer took his wife and the bank took his hope and the world tried to convince him that the old ways were dead. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, baby. You were right. You were right about all of it. Your grandmother was right. The land was right. And I was too proud and too scared to listen." Clara buried her face in her father's shoulder and sobbed, not from sadness, from the overwhelming, crushing weight of vindication, from the knowledge that her grandmother's trust had not been misplaced, that the seeds had known what to do, that the land had been waiting for someone to listen instead of just commanding, from the certainty, deep in her bones, that the world could still be healed if people would just remember how to be humble before nature. The final weighbridge numbers came in that evening at the grain elevator, under lights that buzzed with moths and excitement. The North 40, the field everyone had written off, the field full of weeds that Bruce Harlow had begged Henry to burn, had produced a yield that broke every record in the state of Kansas, not just for that drought year, for any year. For any season in the recorded history of the county, the protein content was so high the mill offered a premium price that Henry hadn't seen in 2 decades, a price that would pay off the bank notice and buy seed for next spring with money left over. The test weight was perfect, the moisture content was ideal, and the soil beneath, where the wheat had stood, it was richer now than when they had planted in April. The clover had fixed nitrogen that would feed next year's crop without a single bag of chemical fertilizer. The organic matter had increased by 2% in a single season, a change that usually took a decade of careful management and government grants. The earthworms were so plentiful that the soil looked like it was breathing, like it had remembered how to be alive. That night, the Whitmore farmhouse glowed with light for the first time in years, windows bright against the October dark. Neighbors brought pies and casseroles and bottles of sweet tea, not out of pity but out of awe and a desperate hope that maybe they could learn something that would save their own farms. Dale Kowalski sat on the porch with Henry and admitted, with a humility that didn't come easily to a man who had built his pride on his son's success, that he had been wrong, that he had let pride and conformity blind him to possibilities, that his own son had already asked if they could get some of Evelyn's seeds for their south section next spring, if Clara would teach them how to plant between the rows. Old Jed Carter brought a bottle of bourbon he had been saving for his 80th birthday, a bottle older than Clara. He poured 3 glasses on the porch railing, one for Henry, one for himself, and one for Clara, which he filled with sweet tea because she was still 17, and some traditions matter more than others. "I've been farming for 50 years, Jed said, his voice rough with emotion and the weight of a lifetime spent fighting the land instead of loving it. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about dirt. Turns out I didn't know the first thing. That girl there," he nodded at Clara, who was blushing furiously, "she taught an old dog something new. She taught me that the land remembers what we've forgotten. And if we're lucky, if we're real lucky, it forgives us for forgetting." By spring, the Whitmore farm had become something of a pilgrimage site. Farmers came from 3 states to walk the North 40, to kneel in the soil and smell its sweetness, to learn about cover crops and nurse plants and the wisdom of grandmothers who had survived worse than drought. Clara spent her senior year of high school giving tours and answering questions and planning a future that looked nothing like the one she had imagined, but felt more right than anything ever had. She didn't go away to college, not right away. She stayed. She worked the land with her father, side by side, planting between the rows, trusting the weeds, listening to the soil. And on the day she turned 18, Henry gave her a gift, a new journal, leather-bound and empty, with a note inside that read, "For the wisdom you will teach your grandchildren. The land is listening. Dad." The Whitmore farm didn't just survive that year. It thrived. It became a testament to the fact that the old ways weren't dead, that nature knew things science was only beginning to understand, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust a seed and a whisper from the past. And somewhere, in the quiet moments before dawn, when the mist still clings to the wheat and the clover blossoms are wet with dew, you can almost hear Evelyn Whitmore laughing, not with mockery, but with joy. Because she knew, she always knew. And she left the seeds where her granddaughter would find them, trusting that the land would provide for those who remembered how to listen. They called her crazy. They called her reckless. They said she didn't know the first thing about farming. But on the 14th of October, when the scales stopped climbing and the silence fell, and a 17-year-old girl stood in her mother's coat with tears on her face and victory in her hands, the only thing anyone could say was the only thing that mattered. They called her right.